Hi, so now you know pretty much everything you need to know about Rousseau's concept. There are, however, two major points that I would like to talk about, among others. The first one is that in Rousseau's concept, there is no check, no security against the tyranny of the majority. The other one is that actually Rousseau advocates for a direct democracy. Rousseau doesn't believe in elected representative democracy. So we'll talk today about those two aspects as well as others. Basically, what we will do, we will look at modern democracies through the prism of Rousseau's thinking. Let's start by comparing the two forms of social contract. As a reminder, in Rousseau's social contract, the terms are as follows. You have to give up all your jungle rights, but in exchange, you gain unspecified conventional rights that are determined by the will of the general interest. In the social contract, we also lay out the form of governance allowing to determine that will of the general interest. So basically, citizen assemblies, frequent votes, and so on. In modern democracies, the terms are roughly the same. However, there's one major difference. Now in modern democracies, in the constitution, in the social contract, you also have some specified fundamental rights that are listed in the constitution. Those are constitutional rights. So the terms are as follows. Again, you have to give up all your jungle rights. And again, you gain unspecified conventional rights, which this time are determined by the will of Parliament. And as I said, you gain constitutional freedoms. You gain specified fundamental rights. In the social contract, again, we also lay out a form of governance allowing to check and balance the powers of Parliament and ensure that those constitutional freedoms will never be infringed. So in practice, it means that a Supreme Court will be set up. Please note also that, as I said, this fuzzy concept of the will of the general interest goes away. Now, it's no longer the will of the general interest that determines what will be your unspecified conventional rights. It's Parliament that does. Now let's talk about finding the right balance between conventional rights and fundamental rights. So, as I said, the goal of constitutional rights, one of its goals is to prevent the tyranny of the majority. And you may think, wow, that's a great idea. And to be on the safe side, should we list all the rights we can think of and enshrine them in the Constitution? Just to be safe. Is that a good idea? Well, no, it's not. So first of all, just as a reminder, why doesn't Rousseau advocate for constitutional rights? Why does he think that they are not needed? Well, Rousseau wrongfully assumes that all citizens are affected by laws in the same way. So because it's a direct democracy, when you vote a law, you're going to be impacted by that law as much as everyone else. So you will not vote for a law that is unfair to you, and therefore you will not vote for a law that is unfair. But you and I, we have experience of democracy, and we know that even though the law is the same for everyone, not everyone is affected by a law the same way, depending on your age group, depending on whether you're a member of a minority, and so on. So that's why you need fundamental freedoms, that's why you need constitutional freedoms to make sure that the majority will not vote for laws that are unfair because they actually don't really apply to them, they mostly apply to you. Okay, so that's why Rousseau doesn't advocate for constitutional rights. But let's come back to that question. Should we list all the rights we can think of and enshrine them in the Constitution? Just to be on the safe side. No, it's still a bad idea. Only rights that are critical to a functioning democracy, as well as rights that are essential to protecting minorities, should be enshrined in a constitution. Let me give you two examples of rights that have been wrongfully enshrined in some constitution. What I'm saying, I'm not saying that those rights are wrong. What I'm saying is that they should have merely been conventional rights, not constitutional rights. My first example is the United States Second Amendment. So I quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And you see in this wording that there's an arbitrage on how to get to a well-regulated militia. And by then they thought that getting to that point meant that the right of the people the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. But this is what a gun looked like when they enshrined this right, and this is what a gun looks like today. Again, I'm not saying that guns should be illegal. What I'm saying is that if they are to be legal, they should be so thanks to a conventional right, thanks to a law voted by Parliament, not thanks to an arbitrage made in the Constitution. Why? Because constitutions are meant to last virtually forever, and therefore constitution should not make arbitrages on trade-offs that evolve over time. Because again, guns is a technology, and technology evolves over time, and therefore it's not the job of the constitution to rule on that arbitrage. It's the job of Parliament. Other example, but same idea. Public pensions in Brazil. So in Brazil, the constitution enshrines the right of every man starting from age 65 and every woman starting from age 60 to a public pension. And again, I'm not saying that it is wrong to retire at that age. What I'm saying is that this decision of constitution, of the Brazilian constitution, to enshrine that age, 65 and 60, it's an arbitrage that is on a trade-off, on a problem which has parameters that evolve over time. It depends on the life expectancy, it depends on the age pyramid. So by enshrining, by setting in stone that age, the Brazilian constitution actually arbitraged again on something on parameters that change over time. And that's not the job of a constitution, that's the job of Parliament. Now let's talk about sovereignty in parliamentary democracy. So first of all, what is sovereignty? So you've heard that term probably, and actually it has different meanings, but here I'm using that word sovereignty in the meaning meant by Rousseau. So for Rousseau, when he talks about sovereignty, he talks about the ability to move around the social body, the ability to make it jump, to make it, perform a backflip, lift the right arm up, and so on. So that's sovereignty, the ability to move that social body. And in a dictatorship, the sovereignty lies within the sovereign, within the dictator. He's the one who decides the movements of the social body. While in Rousseau's democracy, the sovereign is the social body. In other words, in Rousseau's democracy, the sovereignty lies in the will of the general interest, aka the general will. And what is the will of the general interest in Rousseau's thinking? Well, it's what emerges from the individual will of all the composing members of the social body. And that will emerges thanks to votes, citizen assemblies, as laid out in the form of governance laid out in the social contract. But can the will of the general interest be delegated to elected representatives? Well, Rousseau is very clear on that. The answer is no. The will of the general interest can only emerge through public deliberation of the citizens, when assembled at frequent intervals according to the rules of governance laid out in the social contract. So that's the will of the general interest. And by the way, as a side note, any vote that would take place outside of the rules of governance laid out in the social contract has no value at all. Rousseau is very clear on that. So let me say that again. Any unconstitutional referendum has no value whatsoever. But will cannot be represented. So you can't have the will of the general interest, you can't have the will of the general interest be represented by elected representatives. Let me quote. sovereignty cannot be represented. For the same reason, it cannot be alienated. It is by essence made of the general will, and will cannot be represented. Will is itself, or it is other. There is no middle ground. Deputies of the people therefore neither are nor can be representatives of the people. They are merely people's commissaries. They cannot conclude anything definitively. Any law that the people in person has not ratified is null. It's not a law. English people believe they are free, but they are wrong. They are only so during the election of their members of parliament. As soon as the latter are elected, English people turn back into slaves. That's it. So let me put that in my own terms. The will of the general interest is again what emerges from the individual will of all the composing members of the social body. And it's your own will. Your own will is essential, an essential part of that will of the general interest. And you can't delegate your will. You only want things, you know what you want, but you can't delegate what you want to anyone else. So for those reasons, actually in parliamentary democracy, this concept of will of the general interest goes away. And that's why I said earlier, conventional rights are determined by the will of parliament, not the will of the general interest. The other thing that I want to point out is that, again, according to Rousseau, what makes laws fair is the fact that those who vote the laws are the ones impacted by those laws. It's a direct democracy. And that's a condition that results in laws being fair, is because those who vote the laws are the ones impacted by those laws. If you delegate the making the laws to parliament, then there's this risk that those who make the laws are not really impacted by the laws they make. And therefore there's a risk of some kind of elected aristocracy. So there's a real risk here, so that's why we need fundamental freedoms if we are to have a parliamentary democracy. As a side note, even though Rousseau is in favor of a direct democracy when it comes to the legislative branch, he, however, advocates for an elected executive branch. So I quote, "The government represents the sovereign. As law is merely the declaration of the general will, it is clear that the people cannot be represented in the legislative power. But it can and must be so in the executive power, which is merely force applied to law." So I want you to remember that part, force applied to law. What is the executive power? Well, it's force applied to law. Think of a sheriff. You elect a sheriff, and the sheriff enforces the law. But the sheriff doesn't make the laws. So, what is the impact and the consequence of the fact that you can't delegate will? What does it mean for parliamentary democracies? Well, it means that parliament is sovereign, not the people. So I know that some constitutions, starting from the French Constitution, say that the people is sovereign, and the people exerts its sovereignty through referendums as well as the will of its parliament. But Rousseau would disagree with that second part. Rousseau would say, okay, the people of France is sovereign when the people vote for referendums, but when it comes to the decisions of a parliament, then French people is no longer sovereign. Parliament is. Members of parliament are not our representatives. They are individuals entrusted by their constituents to become part of the sovereign. Why? Because you can't delegate will. The form of governance and the fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution are there to ensure a strong dependence of members of parliament towards their constituents. But members of parliament have their own will, and as temporary members of the sovereign, they have the full legitimacy to vote according to their own will. So let me take an example. Let's say that a member of parliament votes for a law, even though the vast majority of his or her constituents overwhelmingly oppose that law. Is that okay? Is that democratic? Does this member of parliament have the legitimacy to vote for this law? Yes, absolutely, because that's a parliamentary democracy. Of course, the constituents of that member of parliament, they will be able to criticize that member of parliament thanks to freedom of speech and thanks to freedom of press, and then during the next elections, they may decide not to re-elect that member of parliament. But as a member of the sovereign, that member of parliament has the full legitimacy to vote for any law he likes, as long as it remains constitutional. So you may think, wow, parliamentary democracy is bad, and Rousseau demonstrates that. Well, here we are looking at parliamentary democracy through the prism of Rousseau's thinking. But there are actually other reasons to advocate in favor of a parliamentary democracy. That's not what we are doing today. And actually, I'll make a second video where I'll explain my personal view on why actually I support parliamentary democracy. Okay, let's put that aside for now, and I would like to lay out some definitions when talking about modern democracies. So, in modern democracies, in parliamentary democracies, the sovereign is parliament. So again, the exception is referendums, but outside of referendums, it's parliament that is sovereign. It's parliament that decides on unspecified. It's parliament that decides on unspecified conventional rights. When the social body has assembled, when all the composing members agreed on a social contract, they have decided to delegate sovereignty to parliament. But in order to prevent parliament from becoming some kind of elected aristocracy, they have constrained the powers of the sovereign. They have constrained the powers of parliament by enshrining checks and balances as well as fundamental rights for all citizens that not even parliament can infringe. So let's come back to that question. What are fundamental rights for? What are constitutional rights for when it comes to parliamentary democracies? Well, as I said, they're here to protect minorities against the tyranny of the majority, but they're also here to avoid abuse of power from parliament and ensure that parliament is sufficiently accountable to its citizens. Let's review the card when it comes to parliamentary democracy. So you have the card about the social body. So you have the social body being the body made of citizens, and you have the sovereign of that social body. It's parliament. Parliament decides which movements the social body will have. So again, let's review the characteristics. What is the composition of the social body? Well, it's all the contracting members. And what is the will of that social body? Well, it's the will of parliament. It's no longer the will of the general interest. It's no longer what emerges from the individual will of each composing member. What are the powers of the social body and of the sovereign? Well, the powers are limited by the Constitution. So let's review the alternatives to the law of the jungle. Dictatorship, Rousseau's democracy, and parliamentary democracy. So, as a reminder, in a dictatorship, the characteristics of the sovereign are as follows. It is composed of a single person, while in Rousseau's democracy, the sovereign is the social body. So it's composed of all the contracting members. While in a parliamentary democracy, the sovereign is parliament, and therefore it's composed of members of parliaments. Coming back to dictatorship, what is the will of the sovereign? Well, it's the will of the despot. In Rousseau's democracy, the will of the sovereign is the will of the general interest. And in parliamentary democracy, the will of the sovereign is the will of parliament. In dictatorships, the powers of the sovereign are unlimited. He is almighty on his subjects. Same for the sovereign in Rousseau's democracy. The sovereign is almighty on its subjects. There are no constitutional freedoms. All rights are conventional. Back to parliamentary democracy, actually the powers of the sovereign, the powers of parliament, are limited by the Constitution. So that's the end of part 2 when it comes to looking at modern democracies through the prism of Rousseau's thinking. I'll be very glad to see you in the next one, in the second part. So have a great day.